Welcome everyone to the first esoterica lecture or reading. I'm going to present Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. And I have here an edition of the text which is attached to the advancement of learning. But in the original publication, this unfinished work by Bacon, which was published posthumously after his death in I think 1627 it was published, or 1626, just shortly after his death, really. It was originally part of the Silva Silvarum, the Forest of Materials, which is also described by Bacon as a natural history in 10 centuries. The cover of which I might actually use here as an image so that you have it in so you have it to hand, but you can easily find it yourself. It quotes Genesis, "Et videt Deus lucem quod esset bona." God judged the light having been seen was good, on its cover. And attached to that, we find the fable of the New Atlantis. And what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to read this text in parts, and I'm also going to discuss a few things, and this will probably be 2 parts in total because it is quite long. Now, let's begin perhaps first with just the idea of Atlantis. Atlantis is a myth, in the modern sense of the word, genuinely a myth, but it could also be, in a more profound sense of the word, be a myth, where we do understand that myths are actually more important than recorded history. And so it's quite striking, don't you think, that Bacon, this, this epitome of early modernity, of the complete reinvention of humanism, and this revolt really against being and against nature that Bacon, amongst others, expresses. Didn't he say somewhere that nature needs to be tortured in order to, well, to get the results from her that we desire? It is precisely in the Novum Organum by Francis Bacon from 1620 that we find the demand for the vexation of nature, for torturing nature to get the results that we want, per vexationis artium. So by means of experiments, we can demand from nature the results that we desire. As we shall see, this is largely inspired by Bacon's peculiar study of the Bible and of King Solomon, but we'll get to this later. Now let me read to you from William Rawley's introduction to the first edition of the New Atlantis from 1627. Raleigh was the chaplain of Francis Bacon, and also to King Charles I and II. Now, when Bacon died, Raleigh was bequeathed Bacon's estate, and that included his unfinished manuscripts, one of them being New Atlantis. And I think that Raleigh really describes well what it is that Bacon intended with this work. So let me read from the edition that I have. "This fable my lord devised to the end that he might exhibit therein a model or description of a college, instituted for the interpreting of nature and the producing of great and marvelous works for the benefit of men, under the name of Salomon's House, or the College of the 6 Days' Works. And even so far his lordship hath proceeded as to finish that part. Certainly the model is more vast and high than can possibly be imitated in all things, notwithstanding most things therein are within men's power to effect. His lordship thought, also in this present fable, to have composed a frame of laws, or of the best stage and model of a commonwealth. But foreseeing it would be a long work, his desire of collecting the natural history diverted him, which he preferred many degrees before it. This work of New Atlantis, as much as concerned the English edition, his lordship designed for this place, in regard it hath so near affinity in one part of it with the preceding natural history. So it has quite a bit of affinity, Raleigh tells us, with the Silva Silvarum, which is also just often, you can think of it as a collection of experiments. And at the same time, we can see here sort of the blueprint, as it were, for the Royal Academy. And in fact, based on this esoteric reading of Genesis and of Solomon, who um, is a figure who had become prominent again in the more sort of clandestine circles around England and other places in Europe. But we can see here also that perhaps New Atlantis, of course, is a fable, but it is certainly not a fable of what's sometimes referred to as a magic realism. It is instead rather something else. So it doesn't add magical elements to what could really be, but instead it genuinely tries to speak something into existence. And that is, for example, what we would now today refer to as genetic modification of plants and of animals. In fact, as we shall see when we read the text, in the New Atlantis, the inhabitants have perfected the art of knowing all causes and hence all effects of nature and thus being able to control nature entirely and completely for the ends of man. So this is at the basis really of the British Commonwealth, this notion of the British Empire, and hence also of the Royal Academy, and as such is also, as a fable, so-called, a mythopoetic work that spake something into existence. And perhaps a few words now on Atlantis to say the obvious. The assumption behind the new humanism here of Bacon is that the world is in need of repair. The idea that creation is unfinished is something that you find again and again. Prometheism, for example, assumes the same thing. This is entirely foreign, this way of thinking, which comes in through, to put it carefully, the Old Testament, really. This sort of thinking is entirely foreign to the Greco-Roman world. To assume that the world is in need of repair and that creation needs to be perfected is ultimately a foreign idea. And it is here, however, promoted by Francis Bacon. So at once, of course, the assumption must be that the world is created and that as such that it can be known in its causes and effects, but at the same time this creation is also imperfect and must hence be perfected according, well, to the ends of man. Now also note that causality by Francis Bacon is explicitly anti-Aristotelian. Not to say that causus, and I won't get into this here, is in any way is already quite a misleading translation of the original Greek. The Greek word is aition, which could be thought of as indebtedness or owing something to something else. I won't go into this here, but just know that already the thinker of cause is in some sense a stifling of the original Aristotelian insight into the so-called four causes, the four idea. And if you remember, Aristotle tells us of four causes, the so-called material, or at least in Aristotelianism, let's say, there's the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Now, Francis Bacon explicitly does away with the so-called final cause. That means to say he does away with the telos. Now, what remains with Bacon is the efficient cause. So that's to say, that which causes a certain effect to a certain pre-desired goal. Don't conflate this, though, with the telos. The telos is the inherent end of something. So the ripening of a fruit in its specific and in its own time, that is quite different from making a fruit, as Bacon will explicitly say in the New Atlantis, that they can let a fruit ripen in just about any time and without regards for the seasons. So that's the destruction of the telos. And Bacon explicitly said that Aristotelianism had been an impediment to the development of the sciences. Now, I think I should also note, just in passing, that this sort of empiricism that we find here is not much of an empiricism at all. It doesn't look at various cases and then just inductively finds a general rule. It's quite the opposite, actually. That's perhaps outwardly what it pretends to do. But as a matter of fact, what really happens is that certain results are desired, and they are desired perhaps also through biblical influences. And then nature is tortured towards achieving those ends. It is not the case that we simply here observe nature and then make up our minds about what the laws might be behind it. Even then, by the way, you would no longer be an empiricist. You would already have stepped in the realm of metaphysics if you're looking at the laws behind. And sometimes I wonder if Richard Dawkins, now he's 80 some years old, if he ever wises up to that. I have my suspicions that he won't, because as you can see, he's in his mindset quite close to a Bacon still, and perhaps without the biblical underpinnings, but ultimately it's the same modus operandi. There's not much thought going into it. It's rather about exercising control and being witty about it at the same time. Now, perhaps a few words on Atlantis. Atlantis is a mythical principle, let's say. To search for Atlantis and to try and find out where the city may have been is, again, a typical empiricistic move. Instead, what we need to understand is that Atlantis is, as it's been spoken into mythic actuality by Plato and others, it epitomizes and has come to epitomize also historically those attempts precisely at controlling perfectly and totally nature. And isn't it striking, though, that Bacon explicitly refers to Atlantis rather than, let's say, Athens, knowing that Atlantis sank, or that it was hit by earthquakes. Whatever it may be, that doesn't make much of a difference. Ultimately, it is a punishment of the gods. And in Plato's unfinished dialogue Critias, or Critias, we find that implied quite heavily, that the gods punish Atlantis, and hence Atlantis disappears. Atlantis is also presented by Plato as the arch nemesis of Athens. In Athens, Plato finds quite a different description for Athens than he does for Atlantis. In fact, the main difference is, as you can find in Plato's dialogue on Atlantis and Athens and the Critias, which I think is the most important one, more important than the Timaeus perhaps, is that Athens is founded on a different principle than Atlantis is. And this might also be a guiding thought for us today if we wish to overcome or get out of modernity and its bastard son postmodernity. So if we wish to overcome these, biblically underpinned sort of pseudo-esoteric, weird, uh, and by the way, isn't it quite striking that a hardcore empiricist, so-called, as Francis Bacon, turns to a fable? I think it's always quite striking that those thinkers who cannot actually think in terms of speculative reason very quickly resort to language that is to do with magic. Now I'm looking around here and I see a book by Richard Dawkins again, which is entitled The Magic of Reality. The Magic of Reality. Okay. Well, if it's magic, then it isn't necessarily reality, is it? In any event, what Bacon does when he resurrects Atlantis is that he resurrects the principle on which Atlantis is founded, and that is lack. It is a purely negative principle. Atlantis is founded not only on lack, but also on the clear opposition, or almost outright opposition, to what the Greeks referred to as scolaire. And scolaire we could translate as leisure, which is a mistranslation. But we should rather think of scolaire as the measure of sufficiency, of peace, of measuredness and sufficiency, and also a sense of equilibrium, fullness, wealth, and richness at the heart of being. And it is precisely this principle that Athens is founded on. So as Plato relates, the Athenians turn their nous all of a sudden in primordial Athens. They turn towards scolaire. Scolaire arrives in their midst, and it is in this moment that another Athens becomes possible. And that is the Athens of fullness and richness. That is the Athens that we still know of today. And it is only in the moment that scolaire arrives in their midst, which is not to do with having, secured enough material wealth, but instead it is taking on an entirely different way of thinking, and thus also of being, that opens up to them the realm of the fullness of being, so that they may see that they already have everything they require genuinely. And thus they turn to mythologia, as Plato says, to mythology, mythologia, as he calls it in Greek, as he refers to it also in Greek already. So mythos and logos in one. They begin to turn to their ancestry, to be in dialogue with their ancestors. So, but of course, one could say Athens has also disappeared in some sense, and Atlantis. Maybe Bacon just chooses Atlantis because Atlantis is a sea power, and it would of course be more likely for England, which is an island, or Britain, which is an island, to become a sea power than a land power, etc. But I think that those remarks would be beyond, sorry, would miss the point in a sense, because these two cities are principles that can recur and do recur throughout history in its unfolding, even if someone does not refer to a certain idea of or a vision of a city or of a place or of a college, for example, as doesn't one doesn't have to refer to it as New Atlantis for it to be again an instantiation of that principle that is Atlantis or is named Atlantis, which is what? Which is in fact the attempt to control and manipulate nature so that nature and what we find natural things are actually torn out of nature. So there's nothing empirical about this whatsoever at all. It is, if we understand empirical merely as saying or simply as saying observing nature, observing and learning from experience, that is not at all what's going on. It's quite the opposite. It's exactly it's almost the reverse, you could say. So this perhaps just in to start with on Atlantis and Athens as we find it in Plato, and of course then Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is utopian and is in a sense, you know, related to other utopian works such as Thomas More's Utopia. And it depicts, however, this is most importantly, a break with the classical world. It's a radical incision. It is indeed a reformed and, in some sense, an enlightened city in the far distance. It has solved, and this is again crucial, it has solved the economic problem. And the economic problem itself is the result. The economic problem, simply put, and there's not much else really to answer this, the economic problem is that the human being is a is not it lacks material sufficiency and only once the economic problem is solved can the human being actually be free to pursue the higher spiritual or intellectual endeavors. But that, of course, again, comes back to the misunderstanding of scolaire that unfortunately this misunderstanding carries and sustains so much of prevalent uh, economic theory, and that is there's no difference between Keynesianism and Marxism in that regard at all, because they both simply want to solve for the economic problem. All sorts of different modern utopias, be it Bertrand Russell's essay In Praise of Idleness or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, are both, as a matter of fact, again predicated on this misunderstanding of the economic problem. Now, at the same time, there is at least within a certain, within a certain limitation, uh, a total liberation. I should also perhaps in the New Atlantis, I should also mention just briefly that Francis Bacon very likely is a Rosicrucian. I won't say more on this here, but if you have never heard of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment or the Rosicrucian movement, you should look into it. It's a very good book by Francis Yates on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. What is striking, perhaps, though, is that Francis Bacon did know of various places and the names of the various places around Latin America, which were mostly unknown at his time. So he must have had some correspondence with travelers and may even himself have traveled more than we actually know of. So he did have some, let's say, esoteric knowledge. Now, the city that they reach, these sailors who sail from Peru, maybe I'll just read the first couple of sentences here. This is Bacon now. We sailed from Peru for China and Japan by the South Sea, taking with us victuals for 12 months, and had good winds from the east, though soft and weak for 5 months' space and more. But then the wind came about and settled in the west for many days, so as we could make little or no way, and were sometimes in purpose to turn back. But then again there arose strong and great winds from the south with a point east, which carried us up for all that we could do towards the north, by which time our victuals failed us, though we had made good spare of them. So that finding ourselves in the midst of the greatest wilderness of waters in the world, without victual, we gave ourselves for lost men and prepared for death. Yet we did lift up our hearts and voices to God above, of course, who showeth his wonders in the deep, beseeching him of his mercy, that as in the beginning he discovered the face of the deep and brought forth dry land, so he would now discover land to us, that we might not perish. So, praying to God, of course, he does. He does make his characters do, so that they may find land, which they also then do. Luckily enough, it is the New Atlantis. The place is called Ben Salem or Ben Salem, the Son of Peace. It could be, of course, as you can hear, that all of a sudden the winds take them not any longer further east, where they were trying to get towards China and Japan, but actually up north. So perhaps it's California or, well, the Pacific Northwest. In any event, we could really assume that it is America, the new Atlantis, the promised land. And it is also assumed sometimes uh, that the survivors of the old Atlantis, if we want to assume that it actually did exist, were believed to have traveled there. So let me now say a few words on King Solomon. Now, King Solomon is, if you maybe you've heard of Oswald Spengler's notion of the Faustian man. For Spengler, in his work, the decline of the West, or the going down of the land of the evening, der Untergang des Abendlandes, the Faustian epoch really begins about 1,000 years ago, and around, let's just say, 1000 AD, with more or less the Gothic age, which is already an expression of the Faustian soul, which is the striving towards infinite space, which is, just to mention this in passing, also the reason why Spengler understands America, and especially Northern America, with its vast, wide and open landscapes, to be really the place where the Faustian soul can fully expand itself. And one of the main influences on Spengler was of course Goethe, who also believed um, and never saw America himself, but did believe that, or had great hopes for America, because it was bereft of history. It was not weighed down by history at all. So he did also believe that in America, especially Northern America, there would be a great freedom for the Faustian soul to come into its own. But let's go back to the Gothic era, perhaps briefly, where the Faustian age begins. It is the attempt, as we can see in the Gothic cathedral, perhaps you can think of the Cathedral of Cologne as a prime example of this, built over hundreds of years, where the Gothic towers really look like rockets, space rockets, trying to, well, fly away. If you think of the stonework, which makes the stone appear as though it wasn't stone at all. It is the attempt with the material that they had, which was at the same time eternal, so stretching out across, the duration of eternity, which would last, and at the same time generating the illusion of lightness, which makes it the attempt to touch the sky by the Gothic towers. And as Spengler points out in the book as well, the monotheism that comes to Europe from the East, which to Spengler is so Christianity when it is combined and leads to some many kind of pseudomorphosis, etc., and metamorphoses within pagan Europe and within Christianity. Christianity is not actually all that important. What's more important is the people who adapt a certain religion and turn it into something else. And at the same time, though, the Faustian man wanted to know from the very beginning, this is when Faustian man becomes Faustian, wanted to know the secrets from this all possessive and omniscient, omnipotent God. And hence, monks, who were some of the first researchers really, tried to steal something away from this omniscient God and this omnipotent knowledge that he had of the world. So from the very beginning, the Faustian era is really coined and marked by that. But Solomon, King Solomon, is the first early Hebrew Faustian. He's a master of magic and poison, or hence also of botany. But not only, he also does have access really to all knowledge. In apocryphal wisdom of Solomon, we find the following passage. So in the book of Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, we find the following passage. Let me read this. For it is he who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements, the beginning and end and middle of times, the alternations of the solstices and the changes of the seasons, the cycles of the year and the constellations of the stars, the natures of animals and the tempers of wild beasts, the powers of spirits and the reasonings of men, the varieties of plants and the virtues of roots. I learned both what is secret and what is manifest. For wisdom, the fashioner all things, taught me. So this is perhaps the most significant, one of the most significant passages in this rather strange work. But it is assumed then that Solomon already knows of all things. And again, here we find that it is the house, it's Solomon's house in New Atlantis, which, or the College of the 6 Days works, which is supposed to be the blueprint for the Royal Society, and which as such is supposed to be the blueprint for the scientific takeover, really, of nature, by having a full insight into what is all that it has been, will be, and is to come, how the seasons work, what are the cycles of the year, and of the years, obviously, of the millennia to come. Again, a quote here from the Wisdom of Solomon: the natures of animals and the tempers of wild beasts. So knowing this, the powers of spirits, we could say perhaps the powers of not not just spirits, but the powers of demons, of knowing what the demons are capable of and how to control the demons, really, and also what the reasonings are of men. So I think the original Greek, though, is not demons here. It's kaithumos therion pneumaton bias. So he doesn't speak of, he does actually speak of spirit here. But still, there are these, I think, elements that we could point to, that we could perhaps think of as, in a sense, demonic forces that he controls. But knowing the beginning and knowing the end, and knowing the elements of the beginning and of the end in the middle of times, as is related here, does imply that Solomon has been taught the full range of what, in a formulaic sense almost, can be known, and hence can also be brought under control. I will here not go into how they arrive at the New Atlantis, as they have to be quarantined for some time, and who they meet, etc. I think that we could forever here speculate. What is important, though, is that Bacon assumes or makes them all good Christians. And they have heard, even though they were so remote and so far away from everything and everyone, they have heard, of course, the gospel of the Lord himself, Jesus Christ, the Savior. So luckily, they're all good Christians, and so we can, of course, assume that these are not just savages, but instead, as they are good Christians at Benzalem, they will, of course, in anything that they do, they are guided by God's grace. In a rather peculiar passage, which is, in my edition at least, and under the subtitle "A Further Question," there's a really peculiar remark by the governor of Benzalem. So they meet with the governor and they have many questions. They do, find it peculiar that not only are they Christian, but also how can such a secret conclave of such a vast sea be able to, or be in touch with, or have any knowledge of, to quote from Bacon himself, of the languages, books, affairs of those that lie such a distance from them? It was a thing we could not tell what to make of, for that it seemed to us a condition and propriety of divine powers and beings to be hidden and unseen to others, and yet to have others open and as in a light to them. I think this is quite a remarkable way of saying it. So they know in Benzalem, the new Atlantis, about any and all affairs from around the globe. They know the languages, they know the history, and however, they have forever been a secret. They have not been, no one has known of them. So they do wonder how that is possible. So let me read from Bacon. At this speech the governor gave a gracious smile and said that we did well to ask pardon for this question we now asked, for that it imported, as if we thought this land a land of magicians, that sent forth spirits of the air into all parts, to bring them news and intelligence of other countries. Let me read again of the first question that was raised to the governor of Benzalem, so that we might appreciate what is being said here. Because I think what happens here is that, again, with the Rosicrucian element, etc., is that there's something being purposely hidden in plain sight. Now listen to this. Again, for that it seemed to us a condition and propriety of divine powers and beings to be hidden and unseen to others, and yet to have others open and as in a light to them. Now, while the governor, of course, smiles at this, and in this sense, assuages or almost debilitates or makes rebuts in a polite way, refutes this assumption that there might be divine powers, there are still quite apparently those powers present in Benzalem, which again are quite divine. So what we can see here is the human being that wants to control nature rising up to such a level where that human being takes on, or wants to take on, divine powers and wants to be able to remain hidden and unseen while having the entire world open to it and transparent. So we have here also the interplay of openness and hiddenness, of concealment and unconcealment, of certain people working in the shadows, and also not really exercising control perhaps over the world, but at least finding, and quite strikingly the word that's being used here, gathering intelligence. Now, without saying too much, these sort of clandestine operations are, of course, nothing that is all too foreign from the place that's called Westminster. And if you look into the history of espionage and intelligence gathering, you'd be surprised, I think, again, if you have never considered this or concerned yourself with this, that this seems also to be implied here, also in this very mindset, let's say, that emerges around this time. So the control of nature also goes together with gathering intelligence about what occurs just about anywhere in the world. And Bacon himself is quite obviously already part of such a circle, given that he already knows the names of certain areas and places in Latin America which would not have been known to him at the time. But let me point out also again, to come back to something, not sure I said it just well enough before, that there can again and again be incisions where so the principle of Atlantis comes to the fore. And if this principle, however, is now running its course, or has run its course, I mean, then perhaps it is time again also for the other principle, the principle of Athens, to come through again. That principle of scolaire, of peace, of equilibrium, of measuredness, of sufficiency, which is quite different from the rampant urge to repair the world, of trying to perfect creation. Trying to perfect what is not created in the first place, of trying to perfect what cannot be perfected because it is already within itself content and full and rich. But again, let's go to the response by the governor. He says, this is the land not of magicians, right? He says, as if we thought this land the land of magicians, that sent forth spirits of the air into all paths to bring them news and intelligence of other countries. Now, given that we're now 400 years later, at the time of anyone reading this in the 17th century, it might have really been spirits that they would have thought of. But for us, we would have to think of those spirits or of the air as radio waves and satellite waves that are used to gather intelligence and data from around the globe in basically real time. So, in some sense, we are using spirits of the air, if we want to speak in these terms. We are using that and to gather intelligence from all other countries that we can gather intelligence from ad nauseum, and also again to exercise an to increase and maximize control. So here, of course, what happens here is, I think, is crucial to understand the rest of what's going on in the text. That he denies this, and that he refers to the land as, this is sort of spoken almost, in a ironically, almost cynically, as it were. But still, there's something hiding here in plain sight, which I think speaks to the attempt to control the air waves and trying to gather through such quote unquote spirits. Don't think of it as demons or spirits in that mystical sense, but really trying to control airwaves by which to gather what is being said and spoken of in other places. So let me get back to the text for maybe a better understanding. It was answered by us all in all possible humbleness after those witty remarks by the governor, which are meant to deflect, really, I think. But yet with countenance taking knowledge that we knew he spake it but merrily, that we were apt enough to think there was something supernatural in this island, but yet rather as angelical than magical. But to let his lordship know truly what it was that made us tender and doubtful to ask this question, it was not any such conceit, but because we remembered he had given a touch in his former speech that this land had laws of secrecy touching strangers. To this he said, "You remember it aright, and therefore in that I shall say to you, I must reserve some particulars, which it is not lawful for me to reveal, but there will be enough left to give you satisfaction." So here, to say the obvious, it's made clear that that secrecy is crucial at the heart of the Royal Society, at the heart of the college, and at the heart of the center of power, and that such secrecy is also necessary again in order to establish control over nature. It must be an esoteric knowledge, so it is not at all here a text of in, in broad terms that is considered with enlightenment for the many, but instead with control in the hands of a few. And also, again, that if we here understand what is meant by angelical, an angel, the word angel comes from the Greek angelos, which means messenger. So there is a network of messengers, of spies. So it's not magical at all, but it is instead angelical in a just very basic sense. There's a network of spies, of messengers, of informants who are spread across the globe to gather intelligence, and that intelligence is used and or necessary also to establish those orders of control. And hence is not magic at all, but again, the basic idea for a network of spies. So there can be a clandestine power. You see, an empire can fall. It can close down its military bases around the world. But if it continues to maintain intelligence gathering around the globe in a network of spies, then that empire has perhaps simply taken on a different, or its original, its primary form again. And we have to understand again what Salomon's house stands for. We can see also, and especially, can't we, that the will, the urge not only to control nature, to rip apart the inherent teleology in everything that is, the inherent entelechia of things, which is destroyed for the sake of being able to control how quickly an apple ripens, regardless of the seasons. This is not just control. This is, again, this is the attempt to repair the world, to perfect creation, which is assumed to be in need of repair, which is assumed to be broken, which is assumed, so lack at the very, not heart, there's no heart here, lack at the rotten core of this false, sick ideology, frankly, that it is. This goes together, as we can see here, this will, this urge, this base drive to exercise control and repair goes together with paranoia, with a deep, deep paranoia, with the need to have a clandestine network of spies everywhere that bring messages, that send messages home to this hidden island, which is not so perfect at all, and perhaps also itself in need of constant repair. But so this urge to repair what is assumed as an imperfect creation is at the same time, always, it always comes together with the sheer paranoia of having to have informants just about everywhere. So what we're going to do in the second lecture next month is I'm going to read those sections where they actually get into all the many ways in which they control nature, which goes into health of the human being and prolongation of life, obviously, the corruption of seasons, the destruction of the telos, and all the other shenanigans that we're in. But again, as I've said before, I think that this principle has run its course. It's coming to an end, and it's time for new Athens. Thank you very much.